I wonder, why is that? Why are you undecided? It's perhaps not a fair question, but I think it's an interesting one.
Well, I suppose, I mean, in one sense, if you like, my inner Tory, if you like, says, one should be wary of change unless it is obvious that that change will lead to an improvement, and that therefore, if you like, the default presumption should be no change. That the status quo is something that, however imperfect it may be, is preferable to ill-designed change. So I've got that side of it. On the other hand, I'm also, as you rightly suggest, a sufficiently libertarian-minded kind of person to believe in progress, and that actually things do get better, and that therefore independence could theoretically, plausibly offer a brighter future. And I've never bought the line that Scotland, uniquely amongst countries, would be incapable of organising its own affairs in a tolerably satisfactory fashion. I think that there would be a difficult transition period, and I think the SNP, perhaps understandably, have tended to downplay the difficulties that will be involved in the transition to independence. But there is absolutely no doubt that Scotland could be a perfectly successful little independent country. And there's a certain appeal to that as well. There is most unionists contain a streak of nationalist in them. From Sir Walter Scott to Donald Dewar and many others besides. There is a nationalist component within Scottish unionism that in many ways Scotland's survival as a distinct place, a distinct idea, as somewhere that could plausibly be an independent country once again, is in one sense one of Scotland's greatest achievements of the last 300 years. So I'm undecided because it boils down to the fact I'm not. The heart used to be, say, independence, but the head was unionist. Now I think you've got a situation where the head can plausibly be nationalist, and perhaps it's the unionist campaign that tugs at the heart a little bit more. So in one respect, I think you can make an argument that the respective camps have swapped positions. None of which really, I suppose, goes terribly far towards answering your question.
But it's a start. It's definitely a start. I just think it's interesting because we don't hear very many sort of right of centre arguments really now for independence. I think as I said before, I think it is moving towards a more left-inflected story about preservation of historical gains. It's an interesting, and there's lots of lovely paradoxes about this, but we have a vision where the SNP, people like Alex, people like Nicola Sturgeon are articulating this view that the only way you can save the British welfare state is to vote for Scottish independence, which is at least sort of something which is historically.
Whereas I think actually it's much more likely that an independent Scotland would be forced to be vastly more, if you like, neoliberal in its general policies and attitudes than many people on the left presently suspect.
I think someone mentioned on a program before that a lot of the kind of neoliberal or right-leaning independent supporters are speaking amongst themselves, the business community, trying to convince each other, this will be fine, go for it, this will be good for us. But they're keeping out of the public debate deliberately. I don't know what you think, Andrew.
You get monstered if you appear in it. But just to pick up what Alex was saying there, why do you think it's more likely that independent Scotland would be given more likely, perhaps, to use?
Because we don't have nearly as much money as many people on the left say we do. And because sooner or later, even in Scotland, it will be appreciated that our schools are not improving, whereas schools in England are improving. State schools, this is. Sooner or later, it will. Even people in Scotland will appreciate that the NHS in Scotland is less productive than the NHS is in England.
But that's an open goal for the Yes campaign.
Control group for reform south of the border, where we actually see improvements, and in Scotland we see almost no improvement in the delivery of public services. In independent Scotland, the risks of capital flight and human flight as well are such that an independent Scotland simply is not going to be able to levy an overall burden of taxation that will be appreciably higher than that pertains in the rest of the United Kingdom. Its room for manoeuvre is going to be very, very limited, and that all the actual incentives in many ways are actually towards a lower tax regime than exists than would exist south of the border. I think there are those sorts of pressures. I think all eventually will push Scotland towards the right, and it will not be a sort of neo-socialist nirvana of the sort that some people are expecting.
But isn't that what the NATO debate was about? Because, like, a lot of people would say that the NATO debate, whether you were in favour of it or not, made independence credible because it shows that they're going to basically toe the line.
Well, the interesting thing about the NATO debate was that the way that the leadership or those, made no bones about bothering to pretend whether, arguing about the virtues of joining NATO or not. There was no pretense that there was actually a substantive policy issue here. It was a purely tactical repositioning to plug a gap.
Because Kenny McCaskill is tired of marching.
Yeah, well,
that's not exactly a substantive argument.
It's a long time since I last saw Kenny McCaskill marching. But I think there's an important point that's coming through here, and this is where, when I was talking earlier on about having the debate, this is really what I'd like to do, because the things that Alex has just said are 50% true. This is absolutely right. And the other half of it is it could go the other way. Because what I would argue is that, let's be honest, we're in Britain. It's one of the world's most neoliberal countries. To go further neoliberal than what Britain already is would take us quite far down the line towards mental. Not in public services, but certainly in terms of economic policy. We couldn't deregulate further. We really couldn't. We couldn't do a lot of the things that neoliberals would do. And this is where I think the debate has to come out. So to what Alex said, I would say great, and I think there's a good chance that some of the things that Alex just said will come to pass. I think that's probably quite right. But there's another half to this, and this is the vision which I think a number of people will be developing over the coming year, and that is that we look at tax and spend within Scotland, within Britain, in a very odd way. The reason that we don't raise all that much money is because we have a hopelessly structured society for raising income tax. If you flatten society, which is to say if you have less gap, less income inequality, the first thing you do is you waste a lot less money at the bottom end of the spectrum on benefits and the cost of failure. You gather a lot, then you collect a lot more money at the bottom end of the income scale because people are actually earning enough to pay tax, and you gather a lot more at the top of the income scale because if you're earning £60,000-70,000, you will be paying your tax. If you're earning £300,000 or £400,000, you're probably not paying your tax because you've probably got a very good accountant. Now, if you were, I was arguing this with the journalist. It was a right of centre journalist. It was quite interesting that he considered, nobody flatten the income disparities in Scotland. You were to keep the same tax rates but collect it properly and crack down on corporation tax evasion, you would instantly create a tax base which is much higher than the one that we've got just now in terms of income without charging people more. So what I'm saying is that I think that this argument is right. I think there's a chance that we go to the I don't know if anyone's heard the phrase Scandamerica, the idea that we can have Scandinavian public services with American tax rates. This is absolutely right. Does Scandamerica become more America or does it become more Scandi? Now that's a debate which is one that we need to have and what we need to do with things. And it's actually possible, and this is a really interesting point of confluence. If you look at, for example, Denmark's a funny situation with welfare because it has, from our perspective, a ridiculously generous welfare state.
I know. Sorry, Rob. I know that for a fact. I've got a friend who is a Danish girl. She's unemployed, and it comes. I'm sure it comes from part of a union, actually, and she gets about £1,000 a month benefit. Mm-hmm.
You can live comfortably. But the other side of that, and this is the bit that people don't know, the phrase is referred to as flex security in Denmark because, surprisingly, their labour protection laws are much weaker. It is much easier to hire and fire in Denmark. Very easy to get. It's much easier than here to fire somebody, to get them out or to get them in, and employment protections are much lower. Now, the reason that they can do that is because life out of employment is really quite comfortable. And so what you have in the Danish case is actually a situation which is a combination of high Nordic welfare and low labour regulation that you might get in the US. Yeah, now, this is much more subtle than anything we've had as a discussion in this country so far, and I hope that before we vote in 2014, I hope that we at least have that discussion.
Yeah, that's.
I mean, I would agree entirely with what Robin is saying there. The Heritage Foundation always in Washington produces its annual index of economic freedom, and the details of how it compiles this need not trouble us. But Denmark routinely comes in the top 5 of these things, well ahead of the United States or the United Kingdom for that matter. It takes about half an hour to start a business in Denmark. I exaggerate, but Danish fire services have been in private hands for nearly a century now. Similarly, of course, famously, if we look at Sweden in terms of its school choice program and the effect that has had on driving up standards across the board in Sweden, we see experimentation. We see a commitment to a genuinely local level of government and democracy of a sort that is unthinkable in this country. There's a lot that can be learned from both the Scandinavian Nordic countries, but also from the United States, from New Zealand, from Canada, I think as well. Places which, in some respects, are just as culturally familiar, more culturally familiar to us than the Scandinavian countries. But yeah. We don't spend an awful lot of time talking about this, at least at Hollywood. There's not very much time spent talking about that sort of thing, is there?
No. Okay, well maybe since that was your two's stories of the year, that went down quite well. Maybe I'll just bring in Michael there. I don't know what in the course of 2012, what particularly struck you? What kind of development?
There's been 2 things. One's a long-running thing. I'll just leave this as a comment and I'll go on to the next one. But the first one is the history of the Scottish Secretary and the position of that. For a long time, there's been this kind of debate. Is the Scottish Secretary the Cabinet's man in Scotland or Scotland's man in London? And I think since devolution it's been changing, because there was a case to be made that every Scottish Secretary had increased the powers that had been brought back to Scotland for a long, long time. Since devolution it's been changing. And now with this current Scottish Secretary, it is absolutely clear that the Scottish Secretary is the Cabinet's man in Scotland and not Scotland's man in London. That's one thing. I just want to leave that one to go. But my big story of the year has been the Labour Party, the Scottish Labour Party in general. There's been so much going on. There's been the rise and I suppose more the whys of Johann Lamont. Her the debate that she started about the something for nothing. Is she becoming more popular? I'm not sure she is. I find that her contributions are generally terrible, actually. But also then there's been this schism with Labour for Indy. And if someone from Labour for Indy is listening, I have tried to contact you. I would like to get you on the podcast. Please get in touch. We have tried. So there's this Labour for Indy. Where is the Labour Party going to go? And there's a lot of support for Labour for Indy. There's been a video published about a kind of internal meeting they had, which ended up in a big fight. I haven't actually watched it yet, but I've got it to go. But apparently it was quite hot stuff. And there's also schisms happening in the Labour Party. Could Labour voters be persuaded en masse to move towards Indy? There's so much interesting stuff going on with the Labour Party. That's my story of the year, because I'm not sure.
They're going somewhere. I mean, it's a bit of a novelty that the Labour Party has any sort of sense of motion in Scottish terms.
But they're going in different directions. It seems like there's a fracture possible.
Well,
I think it's very important not to miss what's going on. So I think it's very important not to miss what's going on in the wider Labour movement just now, because it's not just about the Labour Party. I'm obviously quite close to the SNP and quite close to the Labour Party, particularly the left of those two parties. So I hear a fair bit that's going on. And I think the most interesting thing I've heard in the last 3 months relating to Labour has got nothing to do with Johann Lamont. And it's all to do with the fact that apparently, I'm told, there has been an influx of applications to join the Labour Party. I've been emailed by people who said, I'm joining the Labour Party. And I say, I'm amazed by this. Why are you joining the Labour Party? He says, I'm joining the Labour Party only so I can join Labour for Indy. Now, I've got emailed me and he said, I'm going back to the party. I wouldn't touch it with a barge pole, but I'm not letting them, and I'm not letting the Labour Party become staunch unionist because most of its members don't believe it. So I'm going to rejoin that party only so I can rejoin Labour for Indy. And I find that really interesting. And I've heard a number of people have told me that.
Alex, sorry if I can...
But the other thing which I think is really important is, again, I have a lot of people have kind of given some praise to Johann Lamont, how she's done things. Now, she's done a better job than Ian Gray, but I don't actually think... I've always, when I did political strategy, I always said landing punches isn't how you win fights. You know, she's all about swing. She's come out swinging far too much.